Welcome to The Thing About Austen, a podcast about Jane Austen's world. I'm Zan.
And I'm Diane. And this episode, we're talking about Barton Cottage. So before we get into the episode, we want to take a moment to share that after a lot of time and consideration, honestly too much time and consideration, we really spent a lot of time pondering our options. But we have finally decided to launch a Patreon for the podcast. Kind of feels like we're a little bit late to the game, but hey, our 5-year anniversary, which is coming up just around the corner, seems as good a time as any. So, and also 5 years. Can you believe it?
That is wild. We'll just, sit and ponder that later.
Yeah.
And we absolutely love doing the podcast. That said, it does require a lot of effort and work. And we have been putting a lot of time and resources into making The Thing About Austen these past 5 years. And if we're being completely honest, it would be nice not to operate in the red.
Yeah, some of you may not know this, but producing a podcast like this does cost money, and that's not even accounting for our time. And so after evaluating, again, many different options and sort of being like, oh, should we do this? Should we do that? Lots of different possibilities were considered, and we won't bore you all by outlining them here. I don't know, some of you might be interested, but
we'll show you the flow chart later,
I'm guessing most of you are like, we don't care. We have ultimately decided to ask for direct listener support as the option that seemed like the best fit for our particular type of podcast and the community that we have here.
So if you would like to help ensure the continued longevity of this project, we would love for you to think about signing up for our Patreon. Head to patreon.com/thethingaboutausten to see our current membership tiers and to join.
There are currently 2 tier options: Mr. Knightley's You Pick Strawberry Farm and Mrs. Austen's Potato Patch. If you know, you know. And to kick things off, we have decided to host our own Patreon pledge drive. Our schedule for the rest of the year, which members of our Patreon have early access to, has us taking off both August and December, since those are always extra busy times of year for both of us. But if we hit 50 patrons this summer, we will go ahead and put out an August episode. And if we hit 100 patrons by this fall, we will buckle down and get a December episode out as well.
Yes.
Again, we just cannot even begin to express to you the very in-depth behind-the-scenes conversation where we're like, oh, that feels like we're asking for a lot. It maybe feels like what the business-type people would like to call a stretch goal, but truly, if even 1% of the people who listen to the podcast sign up, we will make that goal. So
yes.
we would love to see it happen.
Yes. And so those episodes will be released on the regular feed for everyone. But by joining our Patreon, you are directly supporting us and helping to make those episodes possible for the entire The Thing About Austen community. And we want to be clear, we plan to always keep our main episodes and our entire back catalog free and accessible to everyone. But just for our patrons, if we hit 25 patrons this summer, we will host a live chat watch-along party of a to-be-determined Austen adaptation. And if we hit 75 patrons by this fall, we will plan an October watch party of Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, seasonally appropriate, and Darcy in leather.
That's all you need to know. So again, to sign up, please head to patreon.com/thethingaboutausten. Okay, so now that Zan and I are both deeply uncomfortable and a little bit sweaty from having to self-promote in this way, now on to the episode. We are talking about Sense and Sensibility. The Dashwood ladies have been kicked out of their beloved Norland Park. And while some of you may quibble over kicked out, it feels accurate, okay?
It was a not so subtle, shove out the door.
And they have arrived in Devon at the invitation of Sir John Middleton to live at Barton Cottage.
So here is from the text. As a house, Barton Cottage, though small, was comfortable and compact. But as a cottage, it was defective. For the building was regular. The roof was tiled. The window shutters were not painted green, nor were the walls covered with honeysuckles. A narrow passage led directly through the house into the garden behind. On each side of the entrance was a sitting room, about 16 feet square, and beyond them were the offices and the stairs. 4 bedrooms and 2 garrets formed the rest of the house. It had not been built many years and was in good repair. Just really disappointed in this cottage.
To start the conversation, you might be wondering, what was so wrong with this cottage? Poor, defamed dwelling. Michael McMorty's article, The Cottage Idea, essentially poses the same question. Quote, if Barton Cottage was a defective example, what was a true cottage? As Jane Austen's irony suggests, more than one answer was possible, for the species was still in the process of definition.
I do appreciate that he calls a cottage a species of house here, just to point that out.
We're putting it in like a taxonomy.
Right. The term cottage had a much more specific and practical meaning in the early 18th century than it does today. According to Daniel Maudlin in his book, The Idea of the Cottage in English Architecture, 1760 to 1860, quote, the word cottage is at root a legal term pertaining to property law derived from the status of its inhabitant as a landless rural laborer, the cottager. As such, it refers to a system of land tenure or lack thereof, and does not imply any specific sort of building.
The 1791 publication of Walker's Dictionary, properly titled A Critical Pronouncing Dictionary and Expositor of the English Language, provides definitions that drive home the origins of the term a bit further. So we have cot, a small house, a hut, a mean habitation; cottage, a hut, a mean habitation; and cottager, one who lives in a hut or cottage.
At the beginning of the 18th century, cottages would have meant these small, basic structures used by laborers. For the sake of clarity, we are going to adopt Maudlin's terminology and describe these as vernacular cottages.
By the mid-18th century, the idea of the cottage as a dwelling came to be divided into two different categories. First is the vernacular cottage, and second is what Maudlin describes as the architect-designed cottage, or the cottage ornée. It is this latter category that most wealthy and middle-class people refer to when describing the kind of house they might live in.
That fundamental split, vernacular cottage versus cottage as an ideal, is really essential to understanding Austen's irony when we describe Barton Cottage in the passage at the top of the episode.
Even within the architect-designed cottages, there were additional categories. The best description of these comes from Maudlin. Quote, broadly speaking, there are 4 types of architect-designed cottage: laborers' cottages, garden seats or retreats, gate lodges, and the gentleman's cottage villa.
Each type had different associations. The laborers' cottages were simple dwellings built by estate owners to house workers, but often, specifically in this category, they were upgraded aesthetically to suit the estate's picturesque plan. Like, it has to fit the vibe of the rest of the estate.
I mean, at least the exterior. Like, we don't really care what's going on the inside.
Absolutely.
But the outside is at least going to look like, like a fake town in an amusement park or something.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The garden seats or retreats were meant for occasional use by the landowner and their family and friends, and were often small, decorative, and intended as charming stops in the landscape.
The gate lodges were considered important since they were positioned at the main entrance of a larger estate and were designed to signal the estate's character and the status to anyone who is arriving.
And finally, the cottage villa was a fairly substantial building, usually with attached gardens, but no larger estate. For example, they were considered locations for rustic retirement near coastal resorts in the south of England. But they could be found throughout the countryside and all over the British Isles, basically anywhere that was picturesque.
Mm-hmm.
And again, if you look at a picture of one of these,
it stretches our definition of cottage by a lot.
Mm-hmm. It's larger than what most people would consider to be like a pretty substantial single-family home.
Right. Yeah. But the thing that ties all of these types of cottages together is that they are aesthetic, almost more so than functional. Maudlin describes these cottages as, quote, art objects to be observed within the landscape.
To understand why cottages became such a cultural obsession, we must account for the rise of what Maudlin describes as, quote, a wider cottage culture, a cultural celebration of cottages and cottage life within the upper ranks of 18th century English society. So this is early #cottagecore.
I was just going to say, we have to acknowledge that this is cottagecore at its seminal moment, right? So this is really a combination of cultural factors all converging at once. So we have classicism motivating people to consider a return to rural ideals. We have Romanticism, with key figures encouraging people to retreat to nature, capital N nature, of course. And we have the Picturesque movement, with William Gilpin and Uvedale Price promoting a specific natural aesthetic. And then we have the Estate Improvement movement, with figures like Capability Brown and Humphrey Repton trying to blend the natural and the picturesque into this idea of an estate landscape design.
So the 18th century cottage revival begins with classical modes of rural simplicity. Among the educated elite, the cottage became associated with an Arcadian pastoral ideal, a symbol of simplicity, virtue, and retreat from urban corruption.
This architectural discourse was responding to a broader cultural trend that Maudlin describes as, quote, admiration and emulation of classical culture. A well-placed, thatched cottage was intended to remind the classically educated observer of the virtues of rural retreat and the simple life.
Romanticism also deepened cultural interest in country life and popularized the cottage as a site of feeling. However, as Nigel Nicholson writes in The World of Jane Austen, quote, the upper section of society romanticized the lower, symbolized by the countryman's cottage, often depicted as rose-garlanded, thatched, sturdy, indestructible, and charming. This obviously overlooks the lived realities of the vernacular cottage and its tenants.
So Romanticism often blended into the picturesque, which is the movement most explicitly associated with the cottage boom. It elevated the cottage into an object of taste. As Catherine Jane Peck explains in her doctoral thesis, The Country Cottage in 19th Century Literature, quote, the picturesque cited roughness and irregularity as the epitome of aesthetic appeal.
This aesthetic helped establish the cottage as a fashionable building type. McMorty explains, quote, in the 1790s, picturesque cottages subsequently came to be one of the important types of 19th century building, both for social and architectural reasons.
And so all of these reasons are essentially converging in the idea of the estate improvement movement. So Capability Brown and later Humphrey Repton reshaped Britain's estate landscape into naturalistic parks, often removing existing structures.
For example, in his book, The Story of the Country House, A History of Places and People, Clive Aslett writes, by his death in 1783, Brown had improved, and that is in scare quotes, nearly 150 estates. Numerous villages were destroyed, their inhabitants rehoused, if they were lucky, in tidy model villages with thatched double cottages.
And so this movement framed cottages as landscape features, visual components of a curated estate. Aslett perhaps most efficiently traces that convergence of all of these movements when he writes, quote, since the middle of the 18th century, Enlightenment philosophy had been trying to correct the social world by comparing it to the origins of mankind in nature. This radical idea was turbocharged by the Romantic poets and provided an alternative self-image for the country house. Cottage simplicity.
You have to kind of like put your hand out in the air, like kind of chef's kiss style when you do that.
I totally was doing that.
This was obviously a contradiction of terms and goals, as Maudlin observes. Quote, comfort, indeed luxury, was central to the cottage ornée as a retreat for the wealthy. Reconciling the common understanding of a villa as a relatively substantial dwelling with the idea of the simple cottage was a cause for reflection for many architects. How do we circle that square,
I love that. So one of these architects that was grappling with this question was James Malton, who in 1798 wrote an essay titled, get ready for it.
We haven't done one of these in a while, so everyone buckle up.
Taking a deep breath. Here we go. An essay on British cottage architecture, being an attempt to perpetuate on principle that peculiar mode of building, which was originally the effect of chance, supported by 14 designs, their iconography or plans laid down to scale, comprising dwellings for the peasant and farmer, and retreats for the gentleman with various observations thereon, the whole extending to 21 plates.
I like a title that tells you know exactly what you're getting. I appreciate that.
Exactly.
You can preview the book online, This was your only option. So Malton writes, when mention is made of the kind of dwelling called a cottage, I figure in my imagination a small house in the country, of odd, irregular form with various harmonious coloring, the effect of weather, time, and accident, the whole environed with smiling verdure having a contented, cheerful, inviting aspect, and door on the latch, ready to receive the gossip neighbor or weary, exhausted traveler. Welcome to Bag End, that is what this is.
That's exactly it. Moulton further reflects, quote, to combine irregularity into picturesque is the excellence of cottage construction, and what has been most attentively considered and aimed at the greater part of the following designs, which he says are intended for, quote, those noblemen and gentlemen of taste who build retreats for themselves with desire to have them appear as cottages or erect habitations for the peasantry or other tenants.
All this context for the construction of the cottage ornée creates an interesting tension, as Azlitt points out. Quote, for the first time in the story of the country house, owners fell victim to inverted snobbery. It became fashionable for houses to ape the appearance of dwellings towards the bottom of the social scale rather than at the top.
So all this context brings us back to Sense and Sensibility and Barton Cottage. Austen does an impressive job of setting the cottage in its geographical context. As Deirdre LeFay observes in her book, Jane Austen, The World of Her Novels, quote, Barton Village lies 4 miles northeast of Exeter. Barton Valley winds between the hills. The manor house of Barton Park, situated half a mile along the valley. Barton Cottage lies at the foot of High Church Down, with the village climbing up the side of the hill behind the cottage.
The cottage itself is also described in some detail, as we read at the top of the episode. It has a sitting room, a dining room, a space for 2 servants, 4 bedrooms, and a kitchen. By today's standards, that's a pretty comfortable family home. And this cottage doesn't fall neatly into any of the 4 previously mentioned categories of architect-designed cottages, since it fails to meet some of the rustic standards of the day.
Yes.
The aesthetics are just not quite there.
Yeah. And perhaps it is because of this failing that everybody seems to have an opinion about Barton Cottage. And they really all do seem to have something to say about it. Variations on the term cottage appear over 60 times in the novel, although obviously a large portion of that comes from mentions of the specific dwelling of Barton Cottage.
Yeah, so some of them might just be them being like, oh, we're going, that's the destination or whatever. But
right. But they really do hold forth on the cottage.
But a lot of it is just them talking about it and describing it in detail. So when Austen has the downwardly mobile Dashwood women move into Barton Cottage, she describes it as small, comfortable, and compact. But as a cottage, it was defective, for the building was regular, the roof was tiled, the window shutters were not painted green, nor were the walls covered with honeysuckles.
So this is definitely Austen framing the cottage's defects. Again, we're saying that with scare quotes here. So this is all in relation to the aesthetically ideal cottage that people would have been familiar with at this point. According to LeFay, Marianne stands in for individuals with the picturesque in mind, writing, quote, Marianne, of course, was hoping that Barton Cottage would be ancient and romantic in appearance, irregular, that's meaning asymmetrical here, in its layout, with a thatched roof, green window shutters, and walls covered with honeysuckle. But it is, in fact, symmetrically planned, modern, and compact, with a tiled roof and casement windows, like so disappointing.
From this first scene with Barton Cottage, we then open up to nearly everyone weighing in on the cottage. Barbara Hardy perhaps best summarizes all these varied opinions in her book, A Reading of Jane Austen. She writes, the smallness of the house invokes various responses. Mrs. Dashwood's impractical plans for improvement, Elinor's controlled rejection of the need for a new grate in the spare bedchamber, Mr. Palmer's rude criticism of the low-pitched roof, and Willoughby's speech about the cottage which protests a romantic disregard of great possessions and is typical of him in its glib and superficial reaction.
So Willoughby's reaction to the cottage actually comes during his implied courtship of Marianne. I use that advisedly.
Implied
courtship of Marianne.
It was implied, and as in everybody else assumed that it was genuine and authentic.
Everyone thought it was real. Yes. So Idone Rhodes writes in her essay, The Cottage as Metaphor, Perspectives on Marianne Dashwood's Improvement. Quote, it quickly becomes apparent that Willoughby's compliments toward the cottage are actually directed at Marianne, and with this context, his comments take on a new meaning.
Willoughby says, "To me it is faultless. Nay more, I consider it as the only form of building in which happiness is attainable, and were I rich enough, I would instantly pull Coombe down and build it up again in the exact plan of this cottage." To which Eleanor says, "With dark narrow stairs and a kitchen that smokes, I suppose."
And he's like, yes, obviously.
Obviously. He's not doing the cooking. He doesn't care.
Right? Yes. So if we take Rhodes' idea that Willoughby is comparing Marianne to the cottage, it starts out flattering enough, but then it becomes a little bit disturbing. He says the cottage is perfection due to its one claim on his affection, which no other building can possibly share. This would be, Marianne is that claim, right?
Uh-huh.
So when he says the cottage is faultless, he also means that Marianne is faultless.
However, he also says that improvements would spoil and rob it of its simplicity, and begs Mrs. Dashwood to promise that your house will remain the same, but that I shall ever find you and yours as unchanged as your dwelling. That's not really something you should wish for a person, to sort of keep them in this arrested development with no growth and chance to change or do anything different with their life.
And that growth would spoil it, will rob it of simplicity. Like that's not something we want.
No, he's trying to preserve her in amber.
Yes, which is creepy, just to clarify. And while this is, of course, just a metaphor, if we look at it as more literal, Willoughby is trying to stop this moment in time. Like we were saying, there's the amber, right? And he's preserving this cottage as is with very little regard to the inconvenience that is actually present to the Dashwoods. As we see with Eleanor being like, yeah, narrow stairs, smoky kitchen. Like, that's my reality, friend.
Yeah. These somewhat unsympathetic views to the realities of living in a cottage actually make him pretty similar to another character in the novel, Robert Ferris. We love our toothpick case man.
That's right. So after making Robert's acquaintance, Eleanor is forced to endure a conversation with Robert in which he states, quote, "I am excessively fond of a cottage. There is always so much comfort, so much elegance about them. And I protest, if I had any money to spare, I should buy a little land and build one myself, within a short distance of London, where I might drive myself down at any time and collect a few friends about me and be happy. I advise everybody who is going to build a cottage."
So Robert Ferris is clearly thinking of a more lavish cottage than the 4-bedroom affair that is Barton Cottage, which, again, all of this is relative, like he's talking about something even more lavish than a 4-bedroom house, which is still much larger than what a lot of people live in today. So context matters here.
Absolutely.
But he makes clear that what he's thinking about is something quite a bit more grandiose when he continues to talk at Eleanor. And this is kind of long, but, for those of you who haven't read this in a while, you need the whole bit.
It's a vibe, right?
"Some people imagine that there can be no accommodations, no space in a cottage, but this is all a mistake. I was last month at my friend Elliot's near Dartford. Lady Elliot wished to give a dance. 'But how can it be done?' said she. 'My dear Ferris, do tell me how it is to be managed. There is not a room in this cottage that will hold 10 couple, and where can the supper be?' I immediately saw that there could be no difficulty in it, so I said, 'My dear Lady Elliot, do not be uneasy. The dining parlor will admit 18 couple with ease. Card tables may be placed in the drawing room. The library may be open for tea and other refreshments, and let the supper be set out in the saloon.' Lady Elliot was delighted with the thought. We measured the dining room and found it would hold exactly 18 couple, and the affair was arranged precisely after my plan. So that, in fact, you see, if people do but know how to set about it, every comfort may be as well enjoyed in a cottage as in the most spacious dwelling. A simple cottage that has a drawing room, a library, a dining parlor that's big enough to hold 18 couple. 18 couple. So that's 36 people.
It's like, if you just know how to go about it, everything's fine.
If you just know how to go about it and have what is actually like a mansion, yeah, you can totally make this work.
Yes. Oh my goodness. This whole speech exemplifies the kind of thinking around cottages from people like Robert Ferris, right? First of all, in his mind, a cottage is huge. But second of all, it's not even the main dwelling, right? Like the way that he's talking about it. This is just a playhouse. This is just that place where you come to party. And of course, the best part of this is also Eleanor's reaction, right? The way she reacted to Willoughby is fantastic. And then we get this reaction. Eleanor agreed to it all. for she did not think he deserved the compliment of rational opposition.
One of the best lines in all of Austen. It's just like...
Slam dunk. It's so good.
And how many times do we all, going about our lives, have that moment where you're just like, you were just not even worth arguing with.
It is not worth engaging.
I cannot have this conversation with you. As Lucy Worsley in her book, Jane Austen at Home, points out, quote, his speech proves his insensitive misunderstanding of the 4-bedroom cottage where the 4 female Dashwoods have to live. The spacious and delightful cottage ornée was a fashionable force in architecture, but the Marie Antoinette-ish game of playing at living in a cottage was offensive to those who, through necessity, really did. So, to be clear, that's really more a reference to, like, playing at cottage compared to a laborer's cottage.
Right.
The Dashwoods are doing just fine. Like, we don't want to lose sight of that reality either. You know, it's not the grand country, basically like mini estate that Robert has in mind, but it's a nice house that most of us today would be thrilled to live in. So,
right. Sign me up. Absolutely.
Yeah. There's so many levels and gradations when we're talking about cottages.
Right. But to have Worsley compare it to the Marie Antoinette of it all is really the kind of the sticking point for what Robert is doing.
Yeah.
And that really brings us to this kind of summary of what the cottage is doing in Sense and Sensibility, which comes from an article by Julie Park titled A Small House in the Country, Cottage Dreams and Desires in the 18th Century English Imagination. So Park writes, the disappointment that Barton Cottage, a purely functional structure, brings as a romantic architectural enclosure is an apt figure not just for the disillusionment of fallen gentry women's imagined realities, but also the deeply fictional status of the cottage as a construct of ideal domesticity in late 18th century material culture. Just really putting an exclamation point on the fact that this was an aesthetic ideal. The reality of Barton Cottage is so disappointing because nobody is actually thinking about really living in these estates.
Now let's turn our attention to cottages as they appear in Austen's other works. And they do show up a lot. Over 120 variants on the term cottages appear in Austen's published novels alone. So we're just going to hit a few specific examples. Before we get into that, though, I just have to say that if you don't know Zan, here's a little factoid about her. She loves like data visualization. And so she did make a little chart of all the occurrences of cottage in Austen's works. So we will include that on our website for the show notes for this episode so that you guys can see that.
And I appreciate Diane for putting up with me, really.
I love it.
So our first example comes from Persuasion. Mary and Charles Musgrove live in Uppercross Cottage, which was a farmhouse upgraded to a cottage upon their marriage. Austen writes, Uppercross Cottage, with its veranda, French windows, and other prettiness, was quite as likely to catch the traveler's eye as the more consistent and considerable aspect and premise of the great house about a quarter of a mile further on.
This description leads Park to conclude in her article that Uppercross Cottage, quote, with its added prettiness of French windows and a veranda, classifies as the cottage ornée. And it fits the broader description of something like a gate lodge. So this is getting closer to the ideal, you know, poor Barton Cottage, not quite there, but Uppercross Cottage, pretty close.
But it's pretty, you know, it's pretty.
Yeah.
And Mansfield Park, the novel most overtly engaging with the idea of landscape design and improvement, includes a scene in which Maria Bertram is trying to show off parts of Southerton while she's in the carriage, and she has to acknowledge that the cottages in the village fall short, again, of the picturesque ideal her class has cultivated. She states, quote, those cottages are really a disgrace.
Basically, those cottages are harshing her buzz, right?
That's right.
She's trying to show off this grand estate, like, I will be mistress of all of this, right?
Yes. And she's like, ugh, those really ruined the view. You know, the vibes are off.
She's kind of having her, like, parallel Lizzie Bennet going to Pemberley moment, except for it's a little bit more squicky, right?
Right. She's like, wow, that is too much reality in my aesthetic view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't want to see that. Thank you very much. And as Nicholson writes, in Sanditon, a cottage which seems from a distance neat and romantically situated is found to house a shepherd at one end and 3 old women at the other in conditions of rural squalor.
Nicholson goes on to write that Jane Austen knew such places. As her father's daughter, she would visit them on charitable missions, both at Steventon and Chawton.
This is such an important reminder, especially after spending time with the cottage as an aesthetic category. Austen knew the vernacular cottages of rural England as well as the architect-designed cottages. She visited them. She understood their structural limitations, their poverty, their cramped living conditions. maybe not quite room for 18 couple.
Right.
And this lived knowledge pushes against the era's cultural fantasy of the cottage as a charming rural ornament.
Which brings us to one more cottage, perhaps the most famous one in Austen's own life, and that is Chawton Cottage. It is easy for us to romanticize Chawton because it's now a beloved museum and literary monument. Much beloved, I should say. But Austen's contemporaries would have recognized it as something quite different.
Worsley frames this tension beautifully. Quote, "Of course, Chawton Cottage was an enormously spacious dwelling by the standards of agricultural workers. But for someone who'd had the chance of being the mistress of Many Down Park and whose brother was the owner of 2 grand mansions, it was something of a second best. Yet perhaps Jane preferred it that way, placing liberty in a cottage above captivity at Godmersham Park."
And to kind of put a fine point on all this discussion of cottages, that tension between fantasy and reality is really at the heart of this discussion of Barton Cottage in particular. It resists picturesque expectations, right? This is a symmetrical, functional building. And this reflects the economic and emotional truths of the Dashwoods situation. And it reminds us, as so many cottages in Austen's fiction do, that the charm of a cottage really depends on where you stand in the social landscape.
So we'll end with this thought from Nicholson. The upper section of society romanticized the lower to excuse the difference between them. And one of the symbols of that romanticism was the countryman's cottage, often depicted in prose and watercolor as rose-garlanded, thatched, sturdy, indestructible, and charming, as a few of them were.
Just a few.
Just a few.
Yeah.
That was not quite the reality for everybody.
Yeah.
Well, if you have any thoughts on cottages or Barton Cottage, you can contact us via our website, thethingaboutaustin.com, or you can email us at thethingaboutaustin@gmail.com. And again, if you would like to support the podcast and help us keep this project going, you can head to our Patreon. That's patreon.com/thethingaboutaustin. We truly, truly appreciate it. And we also always appreciate the support that comes from a 5-star Apple Podcast review. So if Patreon isn't an option for you right now, maybe consider hitting that 5 stars button, like listener Amelie0223, who says, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that this podcast is required listening for any Jane Austen fan." Or listener L. Chris, who says, "Each episode is so fascinating and the hosts have great chemistry. I enjoy listening to their banter and pure delight in learning."
Aw, thank you.
That's so nice.
Stay tuned for next episode. We will be talking about Mrs. Clay being under Mr. Elliot's protection.
Thanks for listening.
Bye.